welcome chosen ones, they weren't confused by you. They simply underestimated the depth you were carrying. What they labeled as inconsistency was actually restraint. What they called silence was observation. And what they dismissed as unpredictability was quiet precision waiting for the right moment. You were never an unsolved problem. You were a reality they didn't have the awareness to interpret. While they tried to place you into categories that made them comfortable, you were evolving beyond anything they could measure. And by the time they realized you were never meant to be figured out, only respected, the distance between where they stood and where you had grown became impossible to close. One moment you were operating with sharp clarity, moving with purpose they couldn't keep up with, and the next, you stepped back, redirected, or removed yourself entirely without needing to explain a thing. To them, it looked erratic, like switches flipping for no reason. But what they couldn't see was the discipline behind your shifts. You weren't losing control, you were exercising it. Every move you made came from a place they didn't have access to, so they filled the gaps with assumptions. They called it instability, labeled it as too much, tried to box it into something familiar just to feel comfortable again. But the truth is, you moved with an internal compass they couldn't read, and instead of admitting they didn't understand it, they chose the easier narrative, one that made you seem unpredictable, when in reality, you were just unwilling to be predictable for anyone. Here's what people rarely admit out loud. Throughout time, those who saw further, thought deeper, or moved differently were almost always questioned before they were ever respected. There's a pattern to it. When someone operates beyond the limits of the group's perception, the group doesn't expand to meet that level. It shrinks the person down with labels. It's not confusion, it's discomfort. Instead of saying, "I don't understand this," they say, "Something must be wrong." Because acknowledging a gap in their own awareness requires humility, and most would rather protect their certainty than explore a mind that challenges it. So rather than trying to understand you, they reduced you to something easier to dismiss. They mistook your stillness for discomfort when it was awareness taking everything in. They read your distance as detachment when it was precision in choosing what deserves your energy. They called it overthinking because they couldn't recognize strategy when it didn't look familiar. While they reacted in the moment, you were already tracing patterns, weighing outcomes, and positioning yourself for what hadn't even unfolded yet. What they laughed at wasn't confusion. It was a level of clarity they hadn't reached. And truthfully, there were moments you chose not to correct them, not because you couldn't, but because it simply wasn't worth the energy. Letting them move with that quiet confidence in their misunderstanding almost became its own kind of amusement. They stood there convinced they had you figured out, completely unaware they were preparing for something they didn't understand at all. What they labeled as madness was really just your refusal to move with the crowd. You weren't reacting. You weren't seeking approval. You were thinking for yourself. And that kind of independence doesn't look normal to people who have only ever followed what everyone else feels and does. You stayed steady when everything around you started shaking. While others rushed to react, you took your time, moved with intention, and never felt the need to justify it. That difference alone made people uneasy. You weren't operating on their timing or their expectations. You were following your own sense of alignment. And that's what disrupted them. Because what they couldn't anticipate, they couldn't influence. Most people rely on patterns they understand, behaviors they can read, but you stepped outside of that rhythm entirely. Not to stand out, but because you refused to be shaped by what was easy to predict or easy to control. But you never followed the script they expected. And that's when everything began to change. Not loudly, not all at once, but in a way they couldn't ignore. The same people who once dismissed you started noticing a pattern they couldn't explain. The warnings you gave kept unfolding exactly as you saw them. The situations you stepped away from revealed why you did. What they once called random started to look intentional, even calculated. And that's when doubt crept in, not about you, but about their own assumptions. Because when outcomes keep aligning with your decisions, It stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like something they never took the time to understand. And now the tone has shifted. The laughter doesn't carry the same confidence, and the whispers feel tighter, more cautious. They're paying attention now in a way they never did before, because something finally clicked. You weren't drifting. You were directing. You weren't lost. You were deliberate. What they once dismissed is now something they can't quite explain but can no longer ignore. The same behaviors they labeled as instability are revealing themselves as control, awareness, and precision. And that realization unsettles them because it forces a new truth into view, one where everything they misunderstood was actually operating on a level they never took the time to see. Before we begin, pause for a second and ground yourself in this moment. If you're feeling the energy of this message, make it official. Tap subscribe and turn on the notification bell, leave a like, and stay connected to what's unfolding here. And if this speaks to you on a deeper level, send it to someone who needs this perspective right now. You didn't just stumble onto this by chance. Something brought you here right on time, and that matters more than you think. So don't just listen. Step into it fully. Type 1111 in the comments so I know who's truly in alignment with this message. All right, let's get into the first point. Number 1, you were never unstable. You were responding to signals they couldn't even perceive. They labeled it as overreacting because they were only seeing the surface while you were reading what was underneath. What felt small to them carried patterns, history, and outcomes you had already connected in your mind. So when you moved with urgency or pulled back without hesitation, it wasn't emotion, it was awareness. They judged the reaction without understanding the information behind it. And that gap in understanding is exactly why they got it wrong. You were never responding to the surface. You were reading what was forming beneath it. While others focused on isolated moments, you tracked the direction those moments were pointing toward. You understood that patterns reveal intent long before actions fully unfold. Most people wait for undeniable proof, something loud enough to force a reaction. You didn't need that. You picked up on the subtle changes, the slight inconsistencies, the things that didn't quite align, and you trusted them. Where others needed confirmation, you moved on recognition, and that's what kept you steps ahead. A slight shift in how they spoke, a smile that didn't reach their eyes, details that didn't quite match what was said before, promises that felt practiced instead of genuine. Small signals, easy to overlook if you're not paying attention, but you were always paying attention. To you, those fragments didn't stay isolated. They connected, built, and formed a clear picture. While others waited for something obvious to happen, you had already seen where it was heading. By the time the truth surfaced for everyone else, you had already adjusted, detached, and moved on long before the moment ever arrived. That's why it looked unstable from the outside, because your decisions seemed to come out of nowhere. To them, it felt abrupt when you pulled back, walked away, or stopped giving someone access. But nothing about it was random. You had already seen the buildup, the inconsistencies, the quiet warning signs stacking one on top of the other. While they overlooked every signal, you were connecting them in real time. And instead of admitting they missed what was right in front of them, it was easier for them to question you. But you weren't reacting blindly. You were acting on clarity they never took the time to see. Your mind was always observing, cross-checking what people said against what they actually did, noticing where things didn't align. It wasn't emotion driving you. It was quiet analysis happening in real time. You didn't need chaos to confirm something was off. A slight mismatch, a repeated pattern, a subtle shift was enough. And that level of awareness unsettles people who rely on surface feelings and convenience to navigate reality. They wait for things to fall apart before they believe it. You recognize it while it's still forming. Where they need fire to react, you already understood what the smoke meant. So when you acted before things became obvious, they dismissed it. When you spoke up, they brushed it off. When you created distance, They labeled it as overthinking. But time has a way of revealing what people ignore. Bit by bit, the same situations unfolded exactly as you had already seen them. And that's when the narrative started to shift. The one they questioned now looked precise. The one they doubted now made sense. What unsettles them most is realizing you weren't reacting out of fear or confusion. You were moving with awareness. And while they were still captivated by what looked calm on the surface, you had already recognized what was quietly building beneath it. Number 2, your distance was never a lack of social ability. It was intentional awareness. They assumed you struggled with people because you didn't chase every interaction or compete for space in every room. But what they misread as hesitation was actually observation. You were listening more than speaking, watching more than reacting, learning how people move without needing to announce yourself. While they were busy trying to be seen, you were focused on understanding, and that kind of quiet attention reveals far more than noise ever could. To them, silence meant absence. Like if you weren't speaking, you must not have anything to say. They assumed quiet meant uncertainty, or that you lacked something they believed should always be on display. But what they misunderstood is that you weren't withdrawing, you were processing. While they filled the space with noise, you were paying attention to what actually mattered. You weren't trying to be seen, you were trying to see, and that distinction changes everything. Because observation builds understanding in ways performance never will. While most people enter a room focused on how they're being perceived, you enter focused on what's actually happening. You notice the small behaviors others overlook, the ones that quietly reveal character. Who dominates the conversation? Who adjusts themselves depending on the audience? Who listens with intention versus who just waits to speak? You pick up on tone, timing, consistency, and the subtle shifts that expose more than words ever could. And the most powerful part is you don't need to announce any of it. You observe, you register, and you understand without ever needing to be the loudest presence in the room. And the irony is, the less people think you're noticing, the more they reveal without realizing it. When they assume you're just quiet or uninvolved, their guard drops. They speak more freely, show more of who they really are, and let things slip they would normally keep hidden. Patterns come out in how they talk, what they emphasize, what they avoid. Meanwhile, the ones trying the hardest to be seen miss all of it because their focus is outward, not inward. But you don't need attention to understand a room. You just need awareness, and that's something they never considered you had. But you walked away with clarity most people never reach. While they were busy trying to be liked, you were quietly understanding everything that mattered. They called it antisocial because they couldn't relate to someone who didn't need constant interaction to feel secure. You weren't seeking approval. You weren't forcing connections. You were choosing them carefully. You let people reveal themselves without interference, without pressure, without performance. And in doing that, you saw the truth of who they were without distortion. That's not withdrawal. It's discernment operating at a level most people never develop. Distance sharpened your perspective. While others got pulled into emotions and confusion, you stayed just far enough back to see what was actually happening. You didn't rush into trust or attachment. You let time reveal who people really were. And because of that, you recognized patterns early, long before they became obvious to everyone else. What unsettled them was how effortlessly you seemed ahead of the situation. Not because you were trying to outmaneuver anyone, but because you were paying attention when they weren't. While they formed connections without thinking, you were evaluating, understanding, and choosing carefully. You were never disconnected. You were selective, and that's what gave you an advantage they couldn't explain. Number 3, your emotional control unsettled them because it gave them nothing to work with. Where they relied on reactions to feel influential, you offered none. No raised voice, no rushed explanations, no visible panic to latch onto. And without those responses, their usual sense of control faded. They couldn't provoke you into a script they understood, couldn't measure your state through emotion because you didn't display it on demand. While they depended on intensity to navigate situations, you moved with restraint. And that kind of composure exposes just how much others rely on reaction instead of real control. If they could trigger a reaction, it gave them a sense of influence, like they had access to you. But you didn't respond the way they were used to. When pressure was applied, you didn't crack. When they pushed, you didn't escalate. When they tried to pull you into emotional back and forth, you stayed grounded instead of engaging. And without that reaction, their usual tactics lost their impact. There was no back and forth to feed on, no emotional display to interpret, just composure. What they relied on stopped working, and that's what made your presence so difficult for them to navigate. To you, your composure was just your default, but to them it felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. They kept waiting for a reaction that never came, replaying the moment in their heads, trying to figure out what they missed. That silence where emotion was expected became louder than any outburst could have been. People rely on predictable responses to feel in control. If they can map your reactions, they can navigate around them. But you gave them no clear pattern to follow, no obvious entry point to influence. And in that uncertainty, they lost their footing, because without something to read, they didn't know how to move. And when they realized they couldn't get a reaction out of you, they had to explain it somehow. So they called you cold, distant, unfeeling, anything that made your control seem like a flaw instead of a strength. But it was never about your emotions being absent. It was about them being directed. You experienced everything just as deeply. You simply chose not to let it dictate your actions. Where others handed over control to impulse, you kept it. And that's what made the difference. You didn't suppress what you felt. You mastered how you responded to it. You took a moment before reacting. You let things settle, examined them, and then decided how to respond instead of letting the moment decide for you. That level of restraint is rare. They mistook it for indifference because they're used to seeing emotions spill out immediately. But you understood the weight of your actions. You knew that one impulsive reaction can undo something long-term, so you chose timing over urgency. While others acted in the heat of the moment and dealt with the consequences later, you stayed grounded, observed the full picture, and spoke or moved only when it carried purpose. And that steady presence had an unexpected effect. It highlighted everything around it. Without saying a word, your composure made their reactions look exaggerated, their impulsiveness more obvious. The contrast wasn't something you created. It simply existed. Where you remained grounded, others appeared scattered. Where you stayed measured, they looked reactive. And in that contrast, they started seeing parts of themselves they usually ignore. Not because you pointed it out, but because your consistency left nothing to hide behind. There's something deeply unsettling about someone who can't be pulled off center, because it removes the illusion of control others think they have. Number 4, your strength was never in overpowering conversations. It was in how precisely you questioned them. You didn't raise your voice or try to outtalk anyone. You stayed composed, asked clear, direct questions, and let the silence do the work. And that's what unsettled people. Because when something isn't genuine, it doesn't hold up under simple clarity. You didn't need to argue. You just brought things into focus. And once things were clear, the truth had nowhere to hide. While others took things as they were presented, you took a moment to look a little deeper. You didn't challenge aggressively. You simply asked for clarity. Simple questions, the kind that should have straightforward answers. But that's where the shift would happen. The hesitation, the change in tone, the way details suddenly didn't line up the same anymore. You watched how quickly calm turned into defensiveness, how easily a story began to adjust under pressure. And in those small reactions, you found more truth than in anything they originally said. You weren't coming at them with aggression. You were simply bringing clarity into the conversation. And clarity has a way of stripping away anything that isn't solid. You stayed calm, asked a little more, and let them fill in the gaps. But with every added detail, the pressure built. Not because you raised your voice, but because consistency became harder to maintain. Truth doesn't need reinforcement. It holds on its own. But when something isn't real, even a few steady questions can make it unravel. What you saw as understanding, they felt as exposure, and instead of acknowledging the gaps, they turned the focus onto you. Suddenly, it became about your questions, your tone, your overthinking. The shift was immediate, deflection instead of clarity. But that reaction told you more than any answer could. Because when something is solid, it doesn't need to redirect attention. You weren't digging for problems. You were identifying inconsistencies. You didn't get pulled in by how something was presented or how confident it sounded. You stayed focused on what actually made sense, and that's what made it hard for anything misleading to hold up around you. You didn't let energy or charisma push you past what actually made sense. You listened with intention, weighing what was said instead of getting caught up in how it was delivered. If something didn't align, you paused right there instead of brushing it off to keep things comfortable. That's the moment most people avoid. They'd rather keep things smooth than question what feels off. But you chose clarity over convenience every time, and that's what unsettled people, because around you, words had to hold up. There was no coasting on charm, no hiding behind noise. It wasn't that you were difficult. It was that you required consistency, and not everyone could maintain it. Number 5, what they called overreactions were actually your system picking up on things before they became obvious. To them, your decisions seemed too fast, too decisive, like you were jumping ahead without reason. But they were only seeing the moment. You were seeing the trajectory. You recognized patterns early, felt shifts before they fully surfaced, and acted before things had the chance to unfold negatively. While they believed in waiting for proof, you trusted the signals that kept repeating. So when you stepped back or created distance, it wasn't emotional, it was intentional. You weren't reacting late like everyone else. You were responding early, and that's what kept you protected. You were picking up on the details most people overlook. The slight shifts in energy, the inconsistencies in behavior, the moments that didn't quite align. To others, those things felt too small to matter, but to you, they were signals pointing somewhere deeper. You didn't wait for everything to fall apart to validate what you sensed. You understood where those patterns were leading long before they became obvious. That's why your timing always seemed ahead. You weren't reacting to events. You were responding to direction. That's why you never felt the need to argue your way through something that didn't make sense. You didn't stay and try to fix what was already showing signs of failure. You chose distance before things escalated, not out of fear, but out of awareness. What looked like withdrawal to them was actually positioning. You understood that staying too long comes with a cost, and you weren't willing to pay it just to appear patient. While they misread your exit as weakness, you were already steps ahead, avoiding outcomes they would only recognize once it was too late. And when everything played out exactly the way you had already seen it, the energy shifted completely. What they once dismissed started to make sense in a way they couldn't ignore. The same decisions they questioned now looked precise, even calculated. They began wondering how you connected the dots so early, how you moved with that level of certainty before anything was obvious. But there was no secret, just awareness they overlooked. You weren't reacting from emotion or exaggeration. You were responding to patterns they didn't take seriously until it was too late. You were aware in spaces where most people chose comfort over clarity, attentive in moments others brushed off, and ready long before anything demanded a response. What they dismissed as overreaction was simply your way of staying ahead. What they labeled as impatience was your refusal to ignore what was already clear. And when everything unfolded exactly along the lines you had seen, the same people who questioned you were left trying to catch up, realizing too late that what you carried wasn't exaggeration, it was awareness they never developed. Number 6, you stepped outside the script by choice, not confusion. while others followed the unspoken rules without question. You recognized them for what they were: patterns of behavior designed to keep everything predictable. You didn't laugh just to blend in, didn't agree just to keep the peace, didn't perform reactions you didn't genuinely feel. And that difference stood out. To them, it looked like you didn't understand how things were supposed to work. In reality, you understood it clearly. You just refused to participate in something that wasn't real to you. A system built on repetition and expectation, and you chose not to follow it blindly. While others stayed busy maintaining appearances, adjusting their reactions, softening their words, shaping themselves to be accepted, you stepped out of that cycle. You didn't feel the need to fill every silence or mirror every emotion just to keep things smooth. And that made a difference. Because when you're not performing, you start to see who is. You weren't trying to disrupt anything. You just refused to lose yourself in something that required you to be anything other than real. That choice didn't need to be loud to be felt. It showed up in what you didn't do, in the moments you didn't follow along, in the reactions you didn't perform. People sensed it instantly, even if they couldn't explain why it felt different around you. You didn't move automatically. You moved intentionally. You weren't missing the cues. You were choosing which ones mattered. And by stepping outside those patterns, you gained a perspective most people never reach, because you were observing the system instead of being absorbed by it. Stepping outside those expectations sharpened your awareness. The moment you stopped mirroring the usual reactions, everything became easier to read. The exaggerated stories, the forced excitement, the subtle need to be validated. It all stood out clearly. You didn't need explanations or confessions because patterns were already speaking for them. When you're not playing the same role as everyone else, people don't know how to adjust, so they default to who they really are. And in that space, without pressure or performance from you, the truth reveals itself without effort. You weren't pushing against the system. You were observing it from a place of awareness. By not automatically following every expectation, you created a contrast that revealed how others truly operated. The roles they played, the pressure they relied on, the patterns they repeated. It all became visible without you having to challenge it directly. And that's what made it difficult for them. Without predictable reactions, their usual ways of influencing people didn't apply to you. You didn't respond to pressure the way they expected, and that removed the leverage they were used to having. They couldn't read your next move because you weren't following a script they recognized. What was meant to pull you in ended up revealing more about them than it ever did about you. The expectations they placed on others, unspoken agreements, subtle pressures, simply didn't hold the same power over you. Where those tactics usually created obligation, they found no traction. It wasn't that you were disconnected from the social world, it's that you weren't confined by it. You moved with choice, not conditioning, and that freedom is what made you impossible to predict. You weren't breaking the rules. You understood them well enough to not depend on them. While others relied on performance to navigate the room, you moved through it with awareness, not imitation. You didn't need to adjust your identity to fit the moment, and that made your presence feel different. To them, it seemed unusual because they were used to adapting constantly just to maintain their place. But what they called strange was simply you operating without a mask, and that kind of authenticity stands out in spaces built on roles. Number 7, your mind didn't rely on hope. You ran scenarios ahead of time. While others stayed focused on what they wanted to happen, you considered what could go wrong and prepared for it quietly. It wasn't negativity. It was strategy. You walked into situations already having thought through outcomes, responses, and exits. So when things shifted unexpectedly for them, it didn't shake you the same way. You had already been there mentally, already mapped the possibilities, and that's what kept you steady when others were caught off guard. Not because you expected the worst, but because you respected reality enough to be ready for it. You understood that life doesn't always announce its shifts, and waiting for clear warnings is a risk in itself. So your preparation went deeper than surface-level planning. It wasn't just about having a plan. It was about being mentally and emotionally equipped for whatever direction things took. You thought things through, explored different outcomes, and adjusted your approach before anything even happened. What others saw as overthinking was actually you building stability in advance. Every possible outcome, every risk, every turning point, you had already walked through it in your mind before it ever showed up in reality. You didn't wait to be caught off guard. You met the possibility first, understood it, and prepared your response. So when you made a move, it looked abrupt to anyone watching from the outside. They only saw the final decision, not the process behind it. They assumed it was impulsive because they hadn't seen the buildup. But there was no panic in your actions, only timing. You weren't reacting to the moment. You were acting on conclusions you had already reached long before anyone else noticed there was even something to consider. You were simply carrying out a plan that had been forming long before anyone noticed a shift. While others made decisions in the moment, you were acting on conclusions built over time, tested, adjusted, and refined in your mind. Every scenario you considered gave you direction, a clear sense of what to do no matter how things unfolded. That's why nothing caught you off guard the way it did for them. It wasn't hesitation or doubt driving you. It was clarity. What they saw as caution was actually control, a level of awareness that doesn't wait for chaos to decide what comes next. What made it stand out was how natural it looked from the outside. While others were caught off guard, trying to make sense of things in real time, you were already steady, already moving with direction. Situations that overwhelmed them didn't shake you the same way because you had already processed those possibilities long before they happened. There was no rush, no scrambling, just quiet execution. You didn't get pulled into the chaos because you had already navigated it in your mind and knew exactly where to step. People mistook your precision for coincidence. They called it good timing, intuition, even luck. Anything but what it really was. But there was nothing random about how you moved. You'd already considered the angles, weighed the outcomes, and positioned yourself accordingly. What looked effortless was actually the result of quiet preparations happening long before anyone noticed. It didn't harden you, it strengthened you. While others were reacting in the moment, you were already operating from a place of understanding, watching things unfold in a way that felt familiar because you had already seen it coming. And what unsettled the most was how unaffected you remained when everything around you shifted. While others struggled to keep up, you stayed steady, adapting without panic or hesitation. They didn't know how to interpret that level of control, so they labeled it something extreme just to make sense of it. But you understood exactly what it was. It was the result of consistency, awareness, and preparation built over time. Not something loud or dramatic, just a quiet mastery that allowed you to move through situations others couldn't handle, leaving them trying to catch up to a pace they never expected.